we can go ahead and begin.
All right, it looks like almost everyone is here. A couple people are still trickling in, but maybe we'll get started. So hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us virtually today for this WICRI learning session. My name is Kalisha Limer, and I'm just now beginning the second year of my WICRI-funded postdoctoral fellowship, and I'll be moderating the session today. Today's interactive session is aimed at making you more comfortable with choosing a focus and writing a research proposal, whether you're a novice proposal writer or you're just looking to learn a few new writing tricks. So I'm very happy to have the privilege of introducing Dr. Samina Ali as our guest speaker today. Dr. Ali is a professor in the departments of pediatrics and emergency medicine, as well as a practicing pediatric emergency physician at the Stollery Children's Hospital. But first, the University of Alberta acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory and respects the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. And of course, we would like to thank WICRI's generous funders, the Stollery Children's Hospital Foundation and the Alberta Women's Health Foundation for making this session possible today. So today's session is going to be a total of 90 minutes, and it will be recorded. We'll have time for questions and discussions at the end, but you can also, if you have any burning questions, you can ask your questions throughout the presentation as well. So without any further delay, I'm going to turn the screen over to today's speaker, Dr. Samina Ali.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for joining us over your middle of the day. There's more learn than lunch being provided this year due to the different format of presentation, but I hope you are all having your lunch while we do this. And the way my screen is set up right now, I can't see the chat, but if you do have questions, if you wish to unmute yourself, or if you want to type it into the chat and one of our WICRI hosts can let me know if there's something there, that would be fantastic. So with that, let's talk about how to write a research proposal. So before we go too deep into this, I just want to thank thank all the CCH CSP supporters who you can see on the screen, and remind you that this educational session today does meet criteria for curriculum training for this program. So bonus. So a little bit about myself. Who am I and how do I end up here in front of you today? So presumably the main reason they asked me to present this, and I've done it before as well, is that I'm a researcher here at the Stollery in the pediatric emergency division. And I research children's pain and ways to improve it, prevent it, and minimize it. I'm also a pediatrician, specifically a pediatric emergency physician. So I have clinical experience in the area that I'm researching, and that I find very helpful. I'm also happen to be a wife, a mother, and a person. And there's like sort of important to remember, because sometimes research can feel all encompassing and overwhelming. And we have to take a step back, particularly in this past year, and remember that as much as we love and are committed to what we do, that we are a person first for ourselves and for the other people we care about around us, and then we do our job or participate in our career. And I absolutely adore what I do, and I have to sometimes remind myself that it's not everything, because it's very easy to get sucked into it, because it's really I find it really fun. So what are we talking about today? We're going to talk about what is a proposal, why even bother, what are the design and the components of it, and what are some tips and tricks that I've learned over the years from smart people and from making my own mistakes that would make it a little bit easier. Now we're already at the end of March here, so I suspect many of you, even those in your first year of your studies, have already written a proposal or who have thought about a proposal or been a part of a team that's had one. So you might be thinking, well, then how is this helpful to me today? Because I already know what the components are and I've done this. Well, I'm hoping, and I've heard from other individuals who've attended this session, that even though some of the simpler parts of it, like design and components, might already be known to them, they picked up a few tips and tricks on how to write and personalize their own proposal to make their chances of successful funding or successful implementation more likely. So what is a proposal? So at this point, and this is a little bit more awkward over the Zoom platform, but I would ask is, we all have probably figured out today that we're not here to talk about what you're seeing on the screen. That's something different. We're talking about a different kind of proposal. What is a proposal? If anyone is feeling brave enough and does not have a mouthful of their lunch, can they unmute themselves and just, or type into the chat box what you think a proposal is and why we have them. And I'll ask Alicia if you can see any responses, that would be great, because unfortunately the way it's set up, I just can't see any responses.
Somebody just added to the chat box, they're calling it a pitch for buy-in.
Yes, thank you. Oh, and you know what? While you were doing that, I figured out how to see the chat box. So thank you very much, Michelle. Yes, it is a pitch for buy-in, absolutely. A thought that is worth trying. I love that. Thank you. Because that's where it comes from. It comes from our heart. It's an idea. It's a question. It's something that's bothering us. For myself, that's where that's my story of my research trajectory. I was sitting in the emergency department taking care of, actually listening to a learner telling me the story of a patient and why they were here. And I couldn't hear them over the screaming of a child. And I knew it was because that child was having a painful procedure. And that moment, that day, that second, I decided I had to do something, that I couldn't just listen to this anymore. Yeah, a presentation, sorry, just looking back, I'm going to roll through here. We have an outline of research project with details regarding methods in order to sustain funding and support. Absolutely, we are selling something here, people, and it's our idea. A presentation of ideas, a new idea for research. Lets reviewers and research teams know your plans. Absolutely, we all have to be on the same page, so we're all approaching it the same way. Consistency is key when we're recruiting, say, for clinical research or using or establishing procedures for basic science research. An opportunity to express and sell innovative ideas. Yeah, thank you. That's fantastic. Thank you, all of you, for engaging and being so open to doing it through the chat box. The theme that I keep hearing is like new ideas, important ideas, your ideas, and a little bit of selling. And while, sometimes sales sounds like a bad word to me working in medicine, it's not in research, because there are, for argument's sake, let's say for CIHR in a given year, 2,000 people with a brilliant idea who want CIHR to fund it, right? So they're all pretty smart people to have gotten far enough to submit a CIHR proposal. What's going to separate those who get funded from those who don't is how well they present their idea. So yeah, we are selling an idea. My paraphrase to my learners is, by the time you finish reading my introduction, you should be convinced that this is the most important subject to ever study in the known universe for all of humankind. Like, you have to be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe we haven't done this already. And when you're feeling that inside, I'm going to get funded. So that's my goal. Yeah. Someone else added, it's like a recipe for conducting your research. Yeah, I actually kind of like that. Thank you. Okay. So this is one of the sort of formal definitions. It's a clear description of the research activity to be carried out and will be a document designed to convince an audience of the merit of the work to be performed. The proposal can make the case for a research activity and can often be considered as a business plan. So if any of you come from business backgrounds or retail backgrounds, it's a business plan. It's showing the people who are giving you the money, because often it involves money, because it's hard to do research without some money, why this is important. Sometimes it's not about money, it's about grades. And you're presenting your research proposal to show your assessors or your supervisors, your mentors, that you've thought through the science thoroughly. So why do we need such a detailed research proposal? What does this do for us? Well, let me show you a short video about why a proposal is important. I could list all these things, but I find particularly through Zoom platform, it's sometimes fun to mix it up a little bit. So let's go with the video. And if it's not audible to you or there's any issues, please let me know and we'll try to troubleshoot right away.
There you are. You have a great idea that your company would benefit from, but there is just one problem. Your great idea requires funding, and it is up to you to convince your company why they should grant you the money needed. In order to do this, you immediately decide to write a research proposal. So let's take a look at what a research proposal is. When someone is interested in obtaining support for research, they often write a research proposal. These proposals are intended to convince people that your ideas and projects are important. They strive to explain how you can satisfactorily complete the project. A research proposal needs to let people know why the project is a good and/or needed idea, and that you understand what information and studies are already out there. Keep in mind that the way a proposal is written is also important, as grammar, structure, and content can make a difference in whether or not the proposal is accepted or rejected. While conducting a proposal, several questions need to be answered so that those you hope will support your research understand the significance and reason behind your work. The following list are some important questions to answer. What are you going to do? How much money do you need to complete your project? How long will it take? Why do you feel the project will help or benefit the sponsors? Why are you the one for the job? What are your qualifications? What will you do with the results? Let's now take a look at some of the important components of a research proposal.
Okay, just gonna click that out. Okay, so that's just to give you a little bit of an idea about the parallels between writing a research proposal and the business world as well. At the end of the day, we're trying to convince our audience of the importance of the work we're doing. So at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is get from here, which, as you can see, this was July 2016, the beginning of an academic year. And we had three lovely radiation therapy students who were working on, they had this idea, perceptions of advanced practice by radiation therapy practitioners in Alberta. And these are shared with permission. These are clips from actual documents that were shared between myself as mentor and these learners. And so, we're starting off, we're at the point in July where we're like, hey, awesome title, like this is where it starts, right? And then 2 years later, they are published in 2018 in the Journal of Medical Imaging and Radiation Sciences, and they graduate with their work completed. Fantastic. This is like the best case scenario where everything happened in time, but it started with an idea and a title and a very empty proposal, and ended up with a published paper on their topic. And they were pretty darn proud, and so they should have been. So anytime you see this orange, obnoxiously orange screen, it's going to be a tip or trick. So this is where, if you're kind of fading out a bit because you're postprandial, you've eaten and you're getting sleepy, or you've already been on 4 hours of meetings, wake up for these ones. These will be the little tricks. So here's the first one. A well-written proposal is more than half of your manuscript. And I cannot stress this enough. If you put the front end work into your proposal, half your manuscript is written. When I take on learners to help me with data analysis and writing up of a paper, often we're waiting for the statistician to have time to do the statistics, right? Because they have lots of things to do. And before we ever see a single statistic, they have written half the paper. So just to give you an idea, here's a really great example. This was Canadian Emergency Medicine Residents' Perspectives on Children's Pain Management. It was published in the Canadian Journal of Emergency Medicine. And yes, that is my little sister. And yes, my mom did make me supervise her. So just to get that out of the way. All right. So introduction and rationale. This was Huma's original proposal, which she used to get, I think it was $2,500 or $5,000 from Miguel to run this project. And you can see her first lines are, pain is the most common reason for seeking healthcare in the Western world. In the ED, pain accounts for up to 80% of all visits. Numerous studies indicate that inadequate pain management during medical care has detrimental effects. Da, 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 da. Now look at the little box on the right side, introduction, that's a cut directly from the paper. Up to 80% of all ED visits involve pain as a component. Numerous studies have shown, oh wait, this looks like something we wrote 2 years ago. So she was able to take her really well-written introduction, shorten it because we often have less words now for introduction in a final paper because we need the extra space for results and discussion now. But she was able to take that introduction rationale, cut and paste it into her introduction, and it is absolutely not self-plagiarism because the proposal was never published, right? So it's just her using her own words. So first things first, choose a topic. What interests you? What do you care about? There's no wrong road to walk down if something catches your attention. And talk it through with a researcher in your field, because there are ways to make it easier or harder, easier or harder for yourself. So you want to do it the easy way, not the hard way. And then reality, reality, reality. And that is where your researcher, mentor, senior friend, etc., is helpful. And what do I mean by that? So it's not uncommon. I was program director for 10 years as well, to have really excited, energetic residents come into my office and say, hey, I want to study asthma. We're like, fantastic, that's great. I want to do a randomized controlled trial comparing drug A to drug B to drug C to see which one helps children have less long-term complications. I'm like, oh, that is so wonderful. How wonderful that you want to help children with asthma live better lives. So how many years are you planning on being a resident? And they're like, what? I'm like, like 3, 5? And they're like, yeah, about that. I'm like, okay, so the project you're describing involves 15 years, right? 20 years if you want to follow them out till their adulthood. Oh, clinical trials involve millions of dollars to run across multiple centers. Oh, it's a full-time job to run a clinical trial, and it'll probably have to be Health Canada regulated because the drugs you're suggesting are not Health Canada approved for. Oh, so let's still do asthma, but how about we start with a survey asking Canadian pediatricians or emergency physicians what they're using currently to treat asthma. So then when you're a big shot researcher in 10 years and you want to do this study, you already know what drugs are being used, so you know which ones to include in your trial and which ones not to. Cool. So same idea, same concept, but we took it from a multi-million-dollar unmanageable project to something they could complete, in this case, in a 2-year fellowship, which is what the time they had. I don't ever want to present it in a way that takes away someone's enthusiasm and energy, because at the end of the day, if you care about your project, it's going to be less work for me as a mentor because you're less likely to walk away from it, hate it, desert it, or wish you'd never started it. And I say that as a learner who, as a Peds Emerge fellow, no word of a lie, told my program director that I hated research and I would never do it again. And he begged me to publish my paper, and I said, I will present it as an abstract and then you will leave me alone. That's how much my experience with research was not positive initially. But here I am today. I spent, I do 1/3 clinical and the rest of my time is research. So things do turn around when you find something you care about. That first project back in training was not something that I cared about. It was important, but it wasn't something I cared about. Children's pain, no, I care about that. So it's not a problem for me to finish that. So ask for help, mentorship, guidance. If you have an idea you care about and you know someone who studies it and who's excited and passionate about it, ask them for help, because that's the person who's going to help you get to where you need to. If you go to someone who's super nice but knows nothing about research, how are they going to mentor you? This isn't coffee with friends, right? This is, you need help to get to your end goal. So you can have the awesome friends to talk it through with, but you need people who either have methodologic expertise or content expertise, and ideally a combination of both. And here's a secret, it doesn't have to be in the same person. So I build teams all the time where we don't have, where one person doesn't have all the expertise. One person brings statistical expertise, one brings content, one brings methods, one brings KT, and on it goes, so that we can build a team that can create the most meaningful end product. But definitely ask for help. This is not something to do in isolation. Research is a team sport. So when you're choosing your team, as I just alluded to, each person needs to bring something unique to the table. You will possibly add others with specific skills. They're like, if you're working on the project and you're like, oh dear, I need somebody, we've added or changed something in the methods as we're developing this proposal, and now I need somebody else. Yeah, bring them on. But this is not a gathering of your friends and loved ones. You do that, you go to a concert with your friends when we're allowed again, with your friends and loved ones. You choose people that you can work with because they bring something meaningful to be grumpy. We've all been on teams or been members of teams or will end up members of teams where we don't end up absolutely loving every minute of working with someone. And that's okay. Use that information in your mind to say, okay, next time I build a team, I'm going to choose A and B over C and D, right? I will work with anyone pretty much once, but if I'm not having fun, I'm not going to work with you again. And that's just because I have enough stress in my life. I'm not going to make my research team a part of it. So draft proposals should be prepared as early as possible. Here's another bright orange tip for you. This is not just a good thing to do. This is actually essential if you can. So I'll give you an example. There's a competition for emergency medicine funding that is due tonight at midnight. And I somehow have ended up on 5 teams, 5 different teams that are going into this competition, which is amazing and exciting, and everybody has great ideas. The people who sent me their proposal 10 days ago, because there was only a 2-month announcement period, so to be fair, nobody had more than 2 months for this announcement. The people who sent it to me 10 days ago got a full, probably, it's only a 5-page proposal, but probably 2 hours of my time reviewing it line by line, editing words, catching typos, reorganizing, working on their budget. Somebody, no kidding, sent it to me yesterday morning. As I was heading in, I saw the email as I was heading into a 7 a.m. shift, and said, really sorry, this took way longer than I thought, and I need this by tomorrow at noon at the latest, because I have to submit it. I have to collate and submit. And bless their heart, like, they were not slacking. This is a huge and very interesting project that they're presenting. It's incredibly good work. And I gave them 55 minutes of my time, and it was much more high level because I didn't have time to go through line by line, because guess where I am at noon today? I'm with you. And that was my priority. Had I received it 2 weeks ago, I would have given it way more time. So as a preceptor or a mentor or a team member, the more time you give people, the better. And here's another tip, and I don't know if I have an orange slide for this or not. Give people deadlines. When you send things out, tell them I need this by. If you just send it out, people kind of deprioritize things, because we often work to deadlines in healthcare, and many of your collaborators will be in healthcare. So give them deadlines, but please give them reasonable deadlines. So my rule of thumb is for like manuscripts and proposals, barring disaster, I give people 2 weeks. If it's tight or I have to turn it around quickly, like it's a revision of a manuscript, I give them 1 week minimum, because they all have competing interests, and we have to be respectful of that. So what needs to actually be in a proposal? What are some of the components? So rather than, again, mentioning all of them, we'll watch a couple of minutes of this video that'll talk you through some of those.
All right, so today let's talk about how to write a research proposal. What should be in it? Whether it is a research proposal for a bachelor study or a master study or a PhD project, roughly speaking, the general steps are similar and the main components are more or less the same. So in this video, let's talk about these general stuff, roughly speaking. First, here's an obvious question. What is a research proposal? What does it do? When we're writing a research proposal, we're essentially just proposing to do a research study. We need to tell the reader what is it that we want to research, what is the question that we want to have answered, and how this question will be investigated and answered. That is what a research proposal does for us to clearly propose our research ideas to the supervisor or the professor or the manager or whoever it is who's going to read and hopefully approve the proposal. And that is also why we need to write a research proposal before doing a research study. Now, what is the first step in writing a research proposal? If we look at how people start writing a research proposal, most students will probably start with a topic in mind. Usually, when I meet my students for the first time and ask them, what do you want to research about? They would normally have an idea, which is good. They would have a topic in mind, or they have some ideas in which they're interested, or they might have some kind of a personal story or anecdote, which represents a general research topic that they want to go into. And this is a great starting point. So really, the first step in writing a research proposal or designing a research study is to have or choose a topic which is of interest to you. But having a topic in mind is really not enough. Nobody can do a research study on a topic. A topic is too general, it's too broad, it's too wide, it's too non-specific. How can we collect and analyze empirical data to address something so general and broad? We've got to take this general broad topic and narrow it down into a researchable question. Well,
Okay, so just to give you, that was just to give you a rough idea of the different steps. So now we'll go through some of those steps. Okay, so another quick tip or trick, do not reinvent rather, the wheel. Ask for a template or an exemplar. And what I mean by this is someone has probably within your team studied in this area before, so they'll have some background information, or if you're extremely lucky, have actually used that research methodology before. So for instance, a number of my learners do medical record reviews or surveys, national surveys, which we often use. We do those two pieces as background information before we plan bigger studies. So if I have junior learners or people who aren't sure research is going to be their thing forever, they might do a survey or a medical record review. And I will give them a template of another learner's medical record review or survey with all the sections and subsections outlined so they can look at it and say, okay, this is only 10 pages total. I can do this. First, that's the first big step. You feel calmed down that it's not 1,000 pages. And the second thing is you can break it down section by section. If you're not sure what limitations means in a proposal, you'll see what prior student X had written, and you can use that as some guidance. So here's one of the first components you'll often see, a title page. And when you're submitting for courses or coursework, often title pages are expected. When you're submitting for funding agencies, they usually aren't. And be careful, don't include it if they don't allow it, because they will still count it in your page count in many of these competitions. And the general principle at most funding agencies is they start counting pages with the first page. And so if they count this lovely, very pretty, monogrammed front page as the first page, they will drop the last page, which included the statistical analysis and a description of the team. And I'm going to hazard a guess that we'd all think that last page was more important than the first. So only do this if you know it's allowable and not count it towards your total page allowance if they have one for the competition you're applying to. So this was for a project called a Survey of Caregiver Perspectives on Opioid Use for Children's Acute Pain Management. So we're in the midst of an opioid crisis in North America. This is about 3 years ago. Esther was a PEDS resident here, and she was going to work with us to help figure out how what parents thought, what parents and other caregivers thought about opioid use for their children when they come to the emergency department. We ended up doing a 2-center study between here and the London Health Sciences Center, because I have a dear colleague and friend who studies pediatric pain there as well. And as a first-year resident, she managed to do a 600 or 700 family survey of 2 centers and was published in Pediatrics and Child Health, the Canadian Pediatric Society journal, last year, and was very well received. But this is how it started: a title, a header, and a list of the people she was working with, and everyone had a very specific role on the team. So generally, a title page should include, obviously, the title, who the authors of the proposal are, where it's going. So in this case, it wasn't necessary because it was just between she and I, but if this were for a specific course, she would have listed the course, the date and the purpose of the proposal if it's going for a course again. We didn't do this in 2017, but in 2021, I definitely would put in a footer that tells you the date and version of this proposal, because we often change things, and definitely when you submit it for ethics approval for the study, they absolutely want you to track the version and the date. So just add it in, and that way you can track your progress as it changes. Very condensed title is important, but avoid extra long titles and jargon. And we've all done this, right? You've opened up the abstract, a list of abstracts or a collection of abstracts for a conference, and you're looking at the titles and there's a whole bunch of words and you're like, that's not even English, and you just move on, right? I've done it where I'm like, ooh, too much science, right? Too much basic science for this clinician. The sad thing is that if you actually read the abstract, sometimes it's very clinically relevant, because my lens is I am interested in the more clinically oriented research, right? Yours might be the opposite, and that's totally fine. But if your title is so jargoned that an intelligent layperson can't understand it, you've lost some of your audience. So keep it understandable. And that is one thing I've learned. I think I used bigger words when I was younger because I was insecure. And the older and more experienced I get, the simpler and simpler my titles get. And my studies now have names like the No Ouch trials. Because I'm like, I don't have to prove anything. And people are like, ooh, that sounds fun. What's that about? And now I have your attention, don't I? And now I can tell you about it. So table of contents, sometimes they're required, sometimes they're not. They're not critical for shorter protocols. If you've got a 3-page protocol for the Department of Pediatrics / Wickery trainee competition, you do not need a table of contents for 3 pages. But if you do have a page limit, this is the first thing to drop in your final version. You may still want one to be able to jump to sections, because you can make this a smart table of contents and it hyperlinks to the sections you need. So that's sometimes nice. This one is from those No Ouch trials that I just mentioned. This was a 100-page protocol because it was going to Health Canada, and they wanted like every little piece of information you could possibly imagine, including, you know, what alternate names I considered for my children before they were born. Like they wanted everything. So 100 pages. But here's a nice example of one that Dr. Dana Thomas did when she was a resident for a 10-page proposal. So the proposal itself, you'll see data analysis ends at page 6. It was only 6 pages. An abstract was 1. So this was actually only a 5-page proposal, but she created this lovely table of contents, which for me as a mentor, when I was reviewing it, I was like, dang, this girl knows what she's doing. 2, I could get to the section I needed to get to quickly. If she asked me a methods question, I would just click methods and I'd end up there. And 3, very easy to eliminate when you're submitting for funding, because you just cut that page out and we're good to go. And ultimately, she ended up publishing this in the Journal of Emergency Nursing. And she had talked to, by a survey rather, had surveyed triage nurses to understand how they felt about managing children's pain in the emergency department, because they are the front line of the front lines. They're the first healthcare provider you see when you walk into the emergency department, and they hold a lot of power and privilege in terms of treating children's pain first before you ever see a doctor. So we wanted to make sure that they were engaged in children's pain management and that they were on board to give children's pain. And by the way, they were. And after we published this study, protocols were added to our emergency department. So if you come as a child to the Stollery Peds Emerge with an injury or an illness that's causing you pain, they will offer you ice, they will offer you a splint, they will offer you ibuprofen or acetaminophen before a doctor ever sees you. So you can at least start getting comfortable while you're waiting to be seen. Research matters. That's the ultimate knowledge translation for the study, right? So let's talk about an abstract. It's a brief overview of the proposal. Abstracts do not contain references or supporting data. Think broad. And I not infrequently receive an abstract with references in it. I'm like, no, all those go out first. Get rid of those. This is your movie poster. This is the thing that's getting people interested. The typical subheadings are background, objectives, methods, and anticipated outcomes. Because remember, this is before you've done the study. The typical subheadings for a published paper are usually background, methods, results, conclusion. But we haven't got any results yet. So we're using anticipated outcomes and objectives as the two different ones. And those are where you get to say what you think is going to happen with these results. And I often write this last, but I should put like 17 stars after that, because I write it last because I'm then able to steal, cut, and paste wonderful lines. Like, you know, when you write a proposal and you're like, oh, dang, that's a really good line. Grab that and put it in your abstract. When you know it's a good one, hang on to it. So that's where I'm not writing new for the abstract. I'm usually just cutting and pasting out of my proposal. But if your abstract is due at 10 p.m., do not do this at 9:50. Okay, and I'll tell you why. Because as I've learned now as a reviewer on the other end of granting agencies, is that the abstract is sometimes where they actually screen you out of a competition. So they will review the abstracts and they'll say, this doesn't meet our program goals, out. And if they'd read the whole abstract, you actually did. But based on the abstract, it wasn't evident. So what I'm trying to say is do it last, but do it really well. This one matters. And it's also where the reviewer, who sometimes is really tired and is doing this late in the evening, this is where they get their first impression of your project. And if the first impression is this is sloppy, there's typos, I don't understand what they're trying to say, they carry those negative feelings into the review of your protocol. Whereas if you wow them with like, this is so tight and well written, then they're much more likely to have a positive and open mind towards your proposal. This project was led by Dr. Fowler, who is now one of our Peds Emerge docs at the Stollery. And this one was a national survey that we did about fears and concerns using opioids across the country for pediatric emergency docs. And she published this project that we did with a Wickery Department of Peds trainee grant, $2,500, was published in CMAJ Open. And CMAJ is our top medical journal in the country. So $2,500, there you go. So it's not always about big bucks, it's about good ideas. All right, introduction. So what is the introduction? This is also known as the background or the rationale. This is where you do your literature review, and you probably spend half your time here. And I do truly mean half your time. It's about 50% here, 40% in methods, and 10% on everything else. That would be my rough estimate of how my time ends up being divided, maybe like plus or minus 5 or 10%. But the reason you want to spend so much time here is if you can't convince yourself that you know everything about this topic and that you're able to synthesize it into 1 to 1.5 pages, you won't be able to convince anyone else, right? You have to be ready to defend this idea to the death in a sword battle, a la Princess Bride. And if you cannot, then nobody's going to buy what you're selling. So this is where you read, X number of articles, you incorporate half of those into your proposal and maybe half of that into your final manuscript. But when you're writing the proposal, you cast your net wide, you make sure you can sit with this topic and feel like you kind of own it. You shouldn't be writing it being unsure if you know everything about this area. I don't mean everything about the disease. Like I study pediatric pain. I do not know everything about pediatric pain. But the last proposal that I can think that comes to mind is we wrote about virtual reality as a tool to decrease children's pain. Well, I have read every virtual reality article set in the emergency department where it was used in the emergency department before I wrote my proposal because I was proposing a study in the emergency. Do I know every study for it when it's used in veterans hospitals with adults or for psychotherapy or no, absolutely not. But do I know all the ones in the ED for pain? Absolutely. Because I wanted to be sure that when I designed mine, nobody said, but somebody's already done that or somebody did it better. I was going to come up with the best version of it. And to give you a quick 30-second personal experience, and this ended up being a mistake on their part, but it just gives you a little bit of insight. That VR project I submitted that to a to a couple of different competitions. I'm very, very happy to say that Wickery Innovation did fund it, and we're running it right now. We're 25 patients or 30 patients into recruitment, and it's going so well. Prior to that, I had tried to submit it to another competition, and they did not fund it, or it might have been, yeah, it would have been before, because I would have already had the Wickery otherwise. So we submitted it before, and they answered back saying, not our cup of tea. And they're not they had different mandates for this competition, what they were looking for. But one of their criticisms was, this project says this has never been done in this manner. It has been done. Here are the references. And I was like, they're calling me a liar. And then I looked at their references, because I'm like, what are they talking about? And as it happened, their references they were referring to were published after the submission date for the application. So they had like a 4 or 5 month lag before they gave me a response. I submitted in, say, January. These papers were published in February. So they literally didn't exist when I wrote my proposal. But it tells you these reviewers went, looked up the topic and said, she's lying. This has been done before. And then use that as a reason to downgrade the score on this application and not fund it. Now, between you, me, and my closest 40 friends on this call, they were wrong. And I did politely let them know that I was not a liar, but that's what reviewers do. They're going to go look. Now, that was exceptionally weird circumstance, and someone gave me, since I'm talking about it, really good advice. They said, when you do your reference list, write something like in just like 8 font in parentheses, something like current up to February the 14th, 2021, so that they know it's a trigger for them that if something was published after that, it ain't your fault. The world keeps turning even after we submit our applications. So just FYI. And the bottom line is the most important one. I think I've already said this. By the time I finish reading your introduction, I should be convinced that this is the most important study in the world. And I only mean that a little bit humorously, but mostly seriously. So when you're doing the literature review, you're presenting the present state of knowledge in the field, confirming that the study is novel. And that doesn't mean that no one's ever studied virtual reality ever. It's what's special about the way you're studying it, Samina. And what I presented to Wickery and what they were appreciative of is I said, other people have studied virtual reality, but they're using really expensive, complicated software that's proprietary. I'm going to go into Best Buy or the equivalent and buy the Oculus Quest goggles and use those, because I want to see if cheaper, more accessible tools work, so that when Rocky Mountain House wants to do this and they have a $500 budget and no child life specialist to back them up, they can still do it. And bless their hearts, Wickery said, yeah, that makes sense. And here we are, where we're studying Oculus Quest goggles and commercially available games for virtual reality. You're going to design your methodology based on the best literature examples. So don't reinvent the wheel. If someone has done an amazing study, for instance, I'm currently really interested in racial disparities in pain management right now in Canada. I think we've been very head in the sand, ostrichy about looking at this topic, but the US hasn't. So we're starting to explore this for our Indigenous people, and rather than reinventing the wheel, we're looking at the amazing million patient database studies that they've done in the US and using that to help us design our methodology, because they did it and they did it right. So let's use and see if we can copy that methodology. And if we're really smart, we'll get the PI from that study to join our study. And then we have all their wisdom on our team. Your goal is to place the project in the context of the related research. So at the end of the day, you want them to understand how your piece of the puzzle, the piece that you are creating, is going to be the one, how nicely it clicks into the bigger picture. So I don't know if any of you do digital online or on your phone do puzzles, but you know, there's that very satisfying click that happens when the piece goes into the spot. That's what you're doing. The picture doesn't have to be finished by the time your puzzle pieces added, but we need to know that it was the right fit to improve and complete the bigger picture for your area of research. Okay, any thoughts or questions so far? And feel free to type them in. Don't be shy. And if not, I'll just keep marching along. And then we can definitely chat at the end too. So let's talk a little bit about literature review. Typically, most grants, even the longest of competitions, give you 10 to max 13 pages. Most entry-level competitions give you 3 to 5 pages. So you cannot have a 7-page background. You can't. It has to be, even for the biggest CIHR competitions, 1 to 1.5 pages, because you need the rest of the room to explain your methodology and your team and your limitations and everything else. So this is a little tip or trick that I've used for almost since I started writing proposals. And what I do is I bold type the first sentence of every paragraph, have about 4 to 6 paragraphs. If I can't sell it to you by the end of 4 to 6 paragraphs, you're not going to buy it anyways. And each paragraph covers a new point that will then allow the next point to build on it to ultimately end with, and this is why we will all die sad and lonely lives if you do not fund this. I might be paraphrasing a bit, but you get the idea. So this was a project that we did actually was just published last week, but you can see we started looking for money in 2016, and we were using a robot to distract children getting an IV in the emergency department. We had him programmed to provide some cognitive behavioral therapy and distraction, and see if having that in the room made children have a less stressful and less painful experience. The short version, in case you're wondering, it doesn't change pain. It absolutely statistically impacts distress. And that makes sense because a robot can't make a needle poke your skin any less painfully. We use numbing cream for that. What it does is it helps distract you away from the painful stimulus so you're less aware of what's going on. So here, I'll just read you the first lines. IV cannulation is one of the most common and painful procedures for children seeking medical attention. Distraction therapy involves engaging children in cognitive tasks to divert them away from pain and distress. Children's rapid uptake of technology offers novel forms of distraction. Our team is uniquely positioned and highly qualified to assess the effects of a humanoid robot to distract children during painful procedures. This proposal aligns with the WICRI Innovation Grant objectives. So it's like, if you just read those first sentences, you can kind of see where I'm going with this. Now, I'll be honest, and I leave this up here somewhat sheepishly because it's not my favorite. I've done way better than this since, but this was pretty good, but it wasn't great. And I will also say proudly, because I think it's really important to hear this one was not funded by WICRI Innovation. So this did not get funded. We were able to finish it and complete the project because we got funded for another project, and then we cost shared with that, and we rode on the coattails of another grant and got this one completed. And I'm not saying that to make anyone from WICRI feel bad, and I'm not saying that because I have any self-esteem issues. I'm actually saying it because this is the reality for researchers. Not everything gets funded. You can get creative and try to get it done anyways, or sometimes you have to park it and find a new opportunity. And that's okay. Same thing with our virtual reality. If I'd stopped after that first opportunity, we would have never done it. But I freaking love that idea, and we made it even better. And you know what? The VR technology trial, it was very similar in methodology to this robot trial. And we took the feedback that we got from the robot trial from the WICRI reviewers and used it to make the VR application even stronger, even better. And you know what? It worked because that one got funded. So you learn every one of these. When you get back an "I'm sorry, we're not funding you" application or email, sorry, if you send it to me, I will respond to you by saying congratulations. And I've gotten a few, Samina, did you actually read the email? I'm like, no, congratulations on getting excellent feedback. We will make this even better next time, and this will find a home. If you love this project, if you want to see it through, we will find it a home in some form. It may not look like what you thought it was going to look like originally. It may morph into something different, but we will pursue it if you care about it enough. That picture is there to remind me that when I am reading your proposal, I want to be as happy as that child, lovingly sitting on presumably her mother's lap, reading an adorable story. You want to be happy and engaged. You don't want it to feel like work for them. You want to make it easy for them to read it. Then we get to the research question itself. There are many iterations of this. These are some of the 100 most critical words in your proposal, and you can't really change them once you start recruiting. This is particularly true for clinical trials and systematic reviews, and more we're having accountability around that, where there's an expectation that you will publish your protocol or register your study if it's a clinical trial with clinicaltrials.gov, or with Prospero if it's a systematic review, so that you are now accountable to the public, and you can only do it the way you said you were going to do it. You can't change your mind, haha, just kidding. It's not showing what I wanted it to show, so I'm going to change my goals. No, you got to be honest in your reporting. Some people do just objectives. Some people do research questions. I do both. And the way I see it is that my objectives are my overarching goals for this study. And then my research questions are the specific questions I need to answer. So this is a study that we actually was funded by a WICRI CRISP grant. And we just finished recruitment just before the pandemic was declared. And then we spent the last year cleansing data, and it did take 1 year because we have 10 centers across Canada and over 2,500 surveys by parents and 600 surveys by children that were completed, including medical record reviews. So we had a lot of data cleansing to do, but it started, the first iteration when we wrote this was the top box. And then look, without my reading it out to you, because you can read it more quickly yourself, look at where we landed in the second lower box in terms of the fundable version of the objectives and research questions and where it started. So it got much clearer, much more specific, much more easy to envision what the goals of the project were. And this didn't go out for any external review. This was myself, the medical student Keon, who's now a resident, but at the time he was a med student. We were writing this together, our team members who were giving us feedback, our patient partners who were giving us feedback, and this is where we landed, at a much clearer, well-written set of research questions and objectives. So and often people will present their hypothesis as well. So if your research question was, does a follow-up phone call from the therapist after radiation treatment increase patient satisfaction as assessed by a questionnaire, your hypothesis might be a follow-up phone call from the therapist will increase patient satisfaction as measured by a questionnaire. It doesn't have to be complicated, but it shows the reader, the reviewer, that you have an idea in mind that you're testing. You're testing a hypothesis. What is your hypothesis? Don't make them guess. So now we get into the 40% I was talking about, the methodology. And as a general principle, these are the subcategories I tend to use. And then of course, each competition can be specific to something that they want to see. Sometimes it's how does it relate to our goals? How does it improve? How are you engaging patients and family partners? Like they might have specific subheadings, but generally you want to explain the design, who you're studying, what your data collection tools are, what the procedure will be, how you're going to analyze this, in what timeline, and what are your ethical considerations and limitations. And I'll be truthful, whether they ask for limitations or not, I always include them, even if it's 3 or 4 lines, because we have analytical, critical minds as reviewers. And as I'm reading a proposal, part of my job is to find the holes in it, right? So I start, from the very first sentence I read, I start making a list of things that are missing or that aren't well explained. If I'm being a good reviewer, I'm also noting all the things that are done well. And I should absolutely report on those too, because that's important feedback as well. But I'm definitely making a list of things that are missing so I can justify any points that I remove from their final score. Then I get to the limitations at the end. And they're like, oh yeah, these are the things that we already figured were going to be issues, and this is how we're mitigating them. I'm like, dang, that's 90% of my list. I've only got one thing left. And immediately, even though those limitations still exist, my concerns drop, because I'm saying, well, they're as smart as me. They figured it out, and they've already told me how they're going to mitigate it. So don't just list it, give them some mitigating principles around it. And sometimes the mitigation is simply, we recognize this is a problem. We are not reaching, for instance, trying to think, a certain demographic of the population. We will, in the larger multi-center version of this study, aim to reach them in that plan, in that stage. It might just be that. You may not be able to fix it, but acknowledging it is important. So when we're looking at choosing our design, you have to choose what design will best meet your goals. If you want to know what people thought of a service, do a survey. So we're just about to start next week. We have child life specialists in our emergency department, and nobody has ever published on what families feel about child life specialists in the ED. They've published about when they help with procedures, but never in general for their overall experience. So we want to know, do families think the child life specialists are useful? And my hypothesis is very useful. And we're going to use this information to argue for 24/7 child life specialist presence in our emergency department. If I want to study what people want to change, as in, what was your pain experience like at the Stollery and what could we have done better? Then I do qualitative interviews because I want them to give me ideas on how to change. Someone might argue, well, you could just put that in a survey, but we don't get into depth and understanding in surveys. We just get lists. So if I really want to know what people want, you have to ask them personally. If I want to know what was done, do a medical record review. Don't ask people. We always lie. We always overestimate. We always think we're better than we are. Guaranteed 100%, because I have done the pain surveys and then the pain medical record reviews, and we always overestimate how good we think we are. It's actually quite humbling to do the medical record review. What is the current best evidence? Like, I want to know what's already out there, do a systematic review. And if I want to know what could be done differently or better in the future, then it's a clinical trial. And I put the last two further down because they are bigger projects. And unless you have quite a bit of protected time for that, those are not novice projects to take on. Certainly not, for instance, as a medical student or a resident who only has 6 weeks or 6 months to do a project. Who are we going to study? Where are we going to study them? And think long and hard about this, because you don't want to be too narrow, but you also can't be too broad, because then it gets diluted. So when we study pain, I often choose musculoskeletal injuries, so strains, sprains, fractures, as my exemplar. And the reason I do this is because children with headaches can have brain tumors. Children with belly pain can have appendicitis. And all of a sudden, I've got a mixed bag of patients, because the way we're going to treat pain for a sprained ankle is very different from the way we're going to treat pain for a brain tumor or a burst appendix, right? So we need to keep it broad enough that it covers most kids. And well, yeah, I think we'd all agree that most kids fall and sprain and hurt ankles and wrists and elbows and things, but not so broad that people argue that the group isn't cohesive enough to draw conclusions across the population. So these are just some examples of the study population that we used for Esther's caregiver perceptions of opioids. So we talked to families whose children had MSK injuries, and then we enrolled them at 2 emergency departments. So we sort of went Eastern Canada and Western Canada, but we were the lead site. How do you collect your data? This depends on what you're doing, depends on your study design. So your tools might be surveys and REDCap, which we are very fortunate to have access through our data center here at Wickery. It might be interview scripts. It might be DNA collecting, saliva collecting kits. It might be looking at pictures of x-rays or MRIs. Depends on what kind of study you're doing. That will influence what your tools are. But you need to describe how they will capture the data you need. Not, we will get information about patients' visits to the emergency department. You need to say, we will get it from these medical records after these data integration management teams provide it to us, and we will store it within REDCap, which is a secure, platform housed at the University of, et cetera, so then they can understand where the information is living. How you will collect it. This is one that historically, when I review learner projects, is often weak. And it's not the fault of anyone. I think it's when you haven't done a project before, if this is one of your first or second or third ones, you can't imagine how the information is going to be collected. So you need to be quite specific. So I think this is an example, like the first one is how we first described, like we're planning on describing the recruitment for the study. And the bottom one is where we landed. And if you read the first one, you have a rough idea of what's going on. And by the time you read the second one, you can actually physically imagine exactly what's happening in the room. But it's only about 4 or 5 more lines. And we've put in some references. We've shown that there's legitimacy to our technique. So if you're using a technique that's been previously used, reference it. References are not only for introductions. References can be used in the methodology, statistical analysis, anywhere where you're showing that there is method to your madness, so to speak. So, and this study was similar to the robot and the VR study. We used iPads for children who were having painful procedures. And we showed that it didn't actually influence pain or distress, but 100% of the families wanted it again. And what we concluded was, again, from the pain point of view, iPads don't help a needle hurt less. They're for distraction. But iPads aren't novel enough anymore in 2021. Everybody's born holding a smartphone. So the kids didn't think this was exciting. So it wasn't as engaging, but every family wanted it because it's better than nothing. So just interesting. That was published this past year as well. Analysis plan. Okay, talk to a statistician. And we are so fortunate again at WICRI, we have statisticians that are available to us, and they're awesome. Marina, who is Yaskina, who is at WICRI, is one of my absolute favorite humans to talk to because she brings a completely different lens to our ideas. And she's like my reality check, where I'm like, I want to do everything, all the studies. And she's like, yeah, do you know what this is going to, how much time this will take and how much data you need? And if you only have 100 patients, we can't study it 20 ways. And you're like, right, okay, let's scale this back to what's realistic and possible given the amount of time we have to complete this project. So this is not the person you go to after you've got the data. That used to be the old style. The new and proper technique, as I see it, is go to them first. Go to them early. Once you've got some rough draft of your study, go to them and ask them to help you if they're not already engaged. At that point, at the very least, go to them and say, is this even possible? Or how are we going to get to the conclusions I want to get to? And if you have the privilege of having a budget, absolutely account for their time. The statisticians are brilliant and they're not cheap. So make sure they fit into your budget. To give you an idea, depending on the project, as an attending or a staff, and not as a learner, it's between $40 to $80 an hour for statistical time from most programs. As learners, you often have access to a certain number of free hours or cost reduced hours. But once you're a big girl or a big boy or a big person, it's going to cost you $40 to $80 an hour. So make sure each research question has an analysis plan attached to it. And Dr. Rosachuk, who's one of our professors within the Department of Pediatrics, taught me this many, many years ago. She said, if you have 5 research questions as a reviewer, and she's often a statistical analysis reviewer, I want to see a plan that connects to each question. So it's crystal clear to me. And one of the earlier grants that I wrote that she was a part of my team for was the very first CIHR grant I ever got funded. And we literally had question A, B, C, D, and then statistical analysis plan A, B, C, D. We made it that clear. And somebody at CIHR thought that was a good idea because that was the first time I ever got a tri-council grant. Timelines, you can write them out, but I find them way more pleasant to see them in this form, in a Gantt chart, because then you're able to visually appreciate how the project is progressing. And then you just run down the list of items in the first column and you see how they ultimately lead to a finished project. So I'm a big fan of these. I'll often just put see Appendix A and put it in. It's also a sneaky way, if you're allowed unlimited appendices, to save room in your proposal, because you then don't actually put anything in your proposal. You might want to put 1 or 2 sentences just in case they don't look at the appendix, because reviewers are not obligated to look at appendices. So you do want to make the proposal stand alone, but I do find these very helpful. The duration and completion dates and the sequences of the steps must be presented. So we start with team meetings and recruiting staff, and we end with manuscript preparation, or often for the bigger grants, it ends with planning of the next study. That'll be my last step. Be really realistic. And as a rule of thumb, whatever you think, the time you think it's going to take, double it easily. And then even weirder things happen, like pandemics. And then all of a sudden research is shut down for a number of months. And you're like, wow, nobody saw that coming. So always at the very least, double your recruitment time. Because as soon as you start studying a process, the patients will disappear if you are doing clinical research. I don't know what the basic science equivalent of that is. I'm sure there's something, but for clinical, definitely as soon as you start studying it, the patients magically disappear. And revisit this frequently throughout the project. See if you're staying on task and if you're and on your timeline. And if you're not, have a realistic sit down reassessment. I've had many learners who, their clinical rotations got really busy. Say, like in this project, for argument's sake, second half of 2018 went off the rails, got really busy. Okay, let's just put little dashes and slow it down and come back to. And so now we're finishing at the end of 2019. That's okay. Alternatively, you end up taking a parental leave. You end up moving cities. Something happens. Life happens. So just keep revisiting. It's not a failure to revisit. It's just an important reality check. And develop this while you're drafting the proposal, because if by the time you draft it, it's now looking like a 4-year project and the grant is only for 2 years, you have to rethink it, because they will not fund a 4-year project if the grant is 2 years, right? So just you have to make sure they match up. Big orange in your face thought: be realistic about the volume of work that can be achieved and the time to completion. So just to switch back to this one, this was one of our Peds Emerge trainees who started her residency in 2017. And by November, December, already had this amazing idea. So she was way ahead of the game. And we're like, oh, dude, we're going to have this finished by April of 2019. So when you finish this 2-year fellowship in June, it's submitted for publication. And we're like, yeah, high fives all around. We're so smart. She did an incredible job with this study. She actually won a National Trainee Research Award for this from Pediatric Emergency Research Canada. And it is currently accepted and in queue for publication in 2021. So despite all of these successes, it took a full extra year to finish this project for a variety of reasons, pandemic not excluded. When you have a bunch of Emerge docs running a study, they get a little distracted when COVID happens. And she ended up finishing her fellowship and moving to another province to take on a job there. So it slowed down her ability to finish it. That's okay. We still saw it through. We did well. Limitations. Like I said, I'm a big fan of this. So this was that 10-center study we did where we asked families what their needs are in the emergency department. What do you need when you come into the emergency department? And we provided there were a lot of limitations to this study. The first and foremost being we ran a 10-center national study on $20,000. So that would be the first problem. So we had to have a lot of practical considerations when we ran this project. They were not there 24/7. We could not translate this to other languages. And we just acknowledged it. We're like, you know what? We're just testing a concept. And if this works out, we'll probably apply to CIHR for $2 million and do this or $1 million and do this the big way. But let's just get something, because we have nothing right now for Canada. And it worked. Budgets. So this is a modest budget of just under $2,500, but I just love how clearly Esther presented it, right? And she chose the subcategories based on what WICRE's trainee grant asked for. They wanted A was salary, B was materials, C was recruitment, D was other, E was statistical. And she absolutely followed it. I don't care if you think you have a better template. I don't care if you think the funder's template is dumb. You still have to follow it, because they want to see what they want to see. So even if your template makes it look prettier or fit in better, you still have to default to what they want. So she showed she needed $800 for a coordinator. She needed just under $600 for materials. She needed $1,000 for gift cards for the people who participated. And she needed $100 for poster printing and about $500 for statistical consultation. So we came down to $2,500. The actual budget was slightly higher, and I wrote a letter of support as her mentor saying, I have some unrestricted research funds. I'll be willing to chip in an extra 500 or 1,000, whatever, to make sure we can see this to completion, so that the reviewers didn't say, oh, she's short $400. This is not possible. We said, no, Samina's got Esther's back. We'll see this through. And as expected, the statistics cost $1,500 more than we expected. So I ended up paying that, thankfully, and we could finish. But just to remind you, statistics always cost more than you think. All right, a little bit of nitty gritty before we kind of wrap up for questions. Read the instructions. Font, spacing, allowable expenses, page limits, and deadlines. If I could put that in 90 font, I would. Some of these agencies are like, if you use anything but Times New Roman 12, we will take away your birthday. Like, they are just like, no, we won't even read it if it's in the wrong font. So if they're that specific, do it. This is one of the few times that I will kill a few trees. I will print their instructions off their website. I'll find like my grade 11 highlighter, and I will highlight things like font and spacing, because some of them are as specific as page margins. They want 2 centimeter page margins and not a millimeter more. So you want to make sure you know that. Allowable expenses. I've seen people write brilliant applications, get funded, and then they lose 20% of them because they're like, yeah, this is totally great project. We love it, do it. And we're taking away 20% of your budget because you said you were going to buy 10 iPads to collect data, and we don't allow hardware. Boom. And they're like, dude, I could have used my another project for that. I could have used that extra 20% for research assistance, and now you've lost it. Or worse, they say your budget is inappropriate, so we reject your entire application after all the work you did. So be very careful. And I actually often email. You can ask Michelle Bayou. I will email her all the time saying, Michelle, can I put this, is this acceptable? Is this an acceptable expense? Is this an acceptable expense? If it's not clear from reading the website. Often it's right there on the website, but if you can't figure it out or it's gray, ask. Page limits and of course deadlines. And with things being digital now, there's almost zero wiggle room on these. They will just, the website or the platform that's receiving it is set to shut down at 0000, and there's nothing you can do to undo that. So be careful about that, and don't admit it under the wire, because without fail, these websites crash because other people are doing the same thing. So try to submit it earlier in the day when all the last minuters are not doing it, because websites absolutely crash. And sometimes the agencies will give you an allowance for that. And sometimes they're like, well, you should have submitted it earlier. Not our problem. Depends. You should describe your study team. Describe each person's credentials and role and what they add to your team. And it depends on your grant. If you have a 3-page grant, this is what Esther did. That's all. If they give you an entire appendix or online page, then you can add like all kinds of, she's the best human I've ever met, and so smart, and best mentor ever, and makes great tandoori chicken. I mean, write whatever you want. But when it is specific and short like this, what you're trying to show is, what is their role? What is their name? Who are they? And what do they bring to the team? So let's look at this one. I think it's worth talking through a little bit. Esther is the PI. She's a first-year PEDS resident. So already I'm thinking, okay, so she's probably not experienced in research. What will she do? Be responsible for creating the proposal and the tool, overseeing the implementation, leading the analysis, and preparing the manuscript. Okay, but how's she going to do that? Because she's pretty junior. Okay, Samina is the PI, co-PI. So now we've got equal weighting on these two people. She's the supervisor, excellent. So Esther's not going it alone as a junior person. She's a PEDS emerged physician, all right, so she has clinical context to this, has a research program in children's pain, expertise in her methodology, and she has national roles that allows knowledge translation. Fantastic. Cool. Megan Fowler, co-investigator, senior PEDS resident, brings expertise in emerge. Okay, cool. Well, she's probably not like bringing anything that Samina or Esther doesn't, or Samina doesn't bring, but oh, look, they're bringing on another learner. That's good. They're mentoring another learner in this project. Love it. Naveen, who's this guy? He's got, okay, this one just says expertise in pediatric pain management. This is, again, you live, you learn. If I were to do this again, I would write that he was an expert in opioid clinical trials, because he is. So 4 years later, I'm even smarter. I would describe Naveen as an expert in opioid because Samina's already a pain management expert. Why do we need Naveen? Naveen's the opioid guy. Truthfully, Samina and Naveen do all their studies together, and we're both opioid and pain experts, but for the purposes of writing it, I'd be pain and he'd be opioid, just to make sure that we present different aspects. Then Amy is our quality of life measurement expert, and Catherine is our addiction medicine specialist. Everybody brings something just a little bit different to the table. And you can see, like, at the time we thought this was like the best application we'd ever done. And even now, looking at it with you today, I'm like, we could have done that, just tweak it a little bit more. So this is where other eyes and other people are very helpful. To round it out, don't forget your knowledge translation plan. More and more and more and more, this is becoming important. It's no longer okay to do fantastic research and leave it in your office. It's no longer okay to do fantastic research, present it at one conference, and never look at it again. Because then the audience who's hearing it and benefiting from it is really limited, and that's not okay. In fact, I'd say it's unethical, and I'm being a bit dramatic, but I really actually have that written on my wall in my office. It says it is unethical not to publish, because once families have participated, given their time, they did it for science, and if we only leave it on a secure laptop in the office, or we only present it at one small obscure conference, how do we're not honoring their contribution to science. So I feel really strongly now that we have lots of other platforms we can use, and social media is actually a really important one. Not suggesting you have to make a TikTok about your research results. You can if you want, it does work, but there are tremendous knowledge mobilization platforms that operate specifically through Twitter. If you had to choose one social media, if you are a Luddite or you just don't like social media, if you just choose one, choose Twitter. Twitter is where academic and policy making decisions happen in the social media world. Skip Facebook, skip Instagram, skip TikTok, go to Twitter. That's where the academic stuff happens. And then you want to let them know what the impact is in the future. Avoid grandiose statements. I'm going to publish this in the New England Journal of Medicine. No, you're not, Samina. No, you're not. This is a survey. It's not going to the New England Journal of Medicine. This study will revolutionize the practice of my field. No, it won't. It will help improve something. It will lead to a better research question. Be realistic. If you're doing an international multi-center trial of a groundbreaking COVID drug, yeah, it probably will go to New England Journal, and it may actually revolutionize the treatment of COVID. But short of that, no. Be realistic and remember a little bit of humility. But humility is always balanced in these proposals with pride in what you do know. So don't be too understated either. Of course, you want to provide a list of the references you used and be consistent in your formatting. I don't know if it's just me, but I'm pretty sure it's not me. But when I see people who like use different, like some superscript here and then subscript somewhere else and then author, like it's just within the same document, it's sloppy. And it tells me they're cutting and pasting from multiple documents. And then I'm automatically turned off. Like it's just like, they didn't even check their references. Right? So clean it up. And if you're using web-based references, click on them and make sure they're still active links. Reviewers absolutely look at your links and look at your references. Sometimes you may have appendices, like including your ethics approval or your operational approval, letters of support, your CV. Make sure they're clean, they're properly created, up to date, and labeled with what the appendix name is, so that it's easy for the reviewer to follow. And then thoroughly review your proposal for errors in grammar and spelling, and then have a second person do the same. And this slide works way better in person because I can see those of you who catch on laugh or smile because I purposely misspelled grammar. And the idea is that we see what we want to see, right? And so I'm expecting it to be spelled properly. I'm not going to see it. Give it to another set of eyes to look at. And when your project is rejected, as I said earlier, do not despair. Do not throw it out the window. Do not throw your laptop away. There will be useful critique in it, and you can revise and resubmit. My favorite example right now is of a colleague who submitted a pediatric emergency study 4 or 5 times to the CIHR, which is most people give up at I should say most, many people give up after 3. He went 4 or 5 rounds. This year, he was the #1 ranked application for his type of study at CIHR. So he got it, and he got it good. So it can be done. So I'll stop there. I'd love to spend like the last 10 minutes just to see if you have any questions, reflections, thoughts, and a big thank you to, of course, the foundations, Stollery Children's Hospital and Alberta Women's Health Foundations for supporting all the amazing work that gets done in women and children's health. And I'll open it up to questions. I'll close the screen so we can stop sharing so we can see each other a little bit better. Yeah.
Great, so thank you so much for your presentation. That was really great. Maybe while people are gathering their thoughts and starting to type them out in the chat box, maybe I'll get started with a few questions.
Sure.
So the first one you kind of addressed in your last story there, but on average, how many times do people typically have to submit a CIHR grant before they are successful? You said that last one.
So for big grants, CIHR, it's extremely rare to get funded on the first go. You submit it the first time with the intentions of getting feedback to understand what CIHR is looking for. That's true. I think that's how most people approach it. Every so often, someone just busts right through on first go, but it's not typical. For the first CIHR grant that I got, that was funded on first go, but it was a small targeted competition for $100,000. The open operating grant type competitions, generally you go a few more times. To give you an idea, myself and Dr. Sylvia LeMay, we were co-PIs for a clinical trial that we call the OUCH trials, or OUCH trial, and that one went, I think, 3 times before we were funded about $700,000 to do that one.
Thank you. Another question I have is, sometimes the hardest part of writing proposal is really just that initial step of just sitting down and getting some words on paper and getting started. Do you have any tips on how to improve that process a little bit?
Absolutely, these are great questions. There's no easy answers to those questions. There's a wonderful article that I read many years ago that was called Tuesdays for Writing. And it was about an emergency physician who was an academic emergency physician, and he never took shifts on Tuesdays. And Tuesday was his writing day. So for him, what he did was he had to block off space in his schedule to say, this is the day I write either proposals or manuscripts. So that's one approach. Deadlines are a nice realistic way to keep yourself moving, for sure. And the other thing that I use a lot with my learners is it's really overwhelming to look at a finished product that someone else has done and say, oh my gosh, I need to write 15 pages. This is like overwhelming. But what I say is break it down into the subsections and aim for any given period of time to only write one of the sections. So when you're having a really on day and you're feeling smart and you're awake and you're really into your subject, write the introduction or the methodology, because those are the really tough parts. And if you are tired or you're post night shift and you're like, oh man, I'm so tired, or, and by night shift, I mean, it could be in the emerger, it could be because your baby stayed up all night. They're both night shifts. And you're tired and you wake up and you're like, what am I going to do today? I can't write this, but I need to. Work on the smaller things. Work on formatting. Work on bold facing and changing type. Work on writing down the names of your team members and making a pretty cover page and finding the U of A logo to put on it. Like, do the pieces that will polish your project without necessarily being tons of brain power. But just start putting words down on paper. And things do eventually come together, but small deadlines. Like today, I'm only going to write the study team. Next week, I'm going to write the X section. That helps. And I often tell my learners, don't worry about meeting space limits. You write everything you think is important down, even if it's twice the word limit. My job as a mentor is to choose the most important words and edit it down. So your job is to put everything you think is important, and I'll use my experience lens to trim out the things that are less important overall. But we never delete them and throw them away. We save them because they're going to show up in your manuscript. When you write your paper, you're going to need a discussion. So you're going to save all that work. It's never wasted. You just save it for the discussion. Yeah. So those are a couple of ideas.
It's a great strategy. I like that a lot.
Hi, Samina. Thank you for the presentation. Sorry, turn my face on here. Hi. I had a quick question. So oftentimes an application will ask for a lay summary.
Yes.
And I wondered if you had any tips for when your methodology is complex and it involves a lot of physiology. How do you go from a general so that your audience is following to then describing methods which may be complex?
So when you write that, two things. One, write it for your grandmother. So if I was trying to explain to my grandmother, I write it for my father-in-law. He's an engineer, he's retired, and he loves talking about sciencey things, but he knows nothing about healthcare, right? So if my smart father-in-law, who knows nothing, very little about healthcare, can understand it, then I'm doing okay. So write it with them in mind, and then literally get them to read it, or somebody else who's not in healthcare. And if they can then tell you what your study is back to you, you have done a fair job. And if my father-in-law says, Samina, you lost me in the third sentence here, then that's the third sentence that I need to rewrite. So engage your wonderful, smart, lay, non-health or non-field. Maybe for me it's healthcare, for someone else it might be physiology or anatomy or public health or whatever, friends and colleagues. And generally a little bit older I find is helpful, because they're honest, because that frontal lobe, like they tell you straight up if it's not good or not. And two, they represent a smart, worldly individual who doesn't have your field expertise.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I have one more if no one else wants to chime in and interrupt me. Everyone's welcome if you are. My last question is about picking the best grant competition for your research. Do you have any strategies or tips on how to pick what's going to be the best fit for your research project?
So I would say as an overall strategy, at the beginning, go small with small projects. So some really good advice I got at the beginning of my career was like, I need CIHR to give me $1 million to study opioids for pain. And they're like, that's adorable, you're a nobody. And so I was like, oh, okay, cool. My mom says I'm important. I had to establish myself in the field. So what I did was I applied for small grants, $2,500 grants, $5,000 grants, $10,000 grants from agencies that cared about my area specifically. So pain agencies or emergency agencies, since my work is pain and emergency. And I built up a little bit of street cred. In 2 to 3 years, got those grants. In 5 years, published those papers. And then 5 years in, went to CIHR, and they're like, oh yeah, Samina kind of is a little bit of a known entity in this field. Let's fund her. And then I get that one grant, and it's a modest one. It was a targeted call. And then eventually I work towards full Tri-Council grants, and then Tri-Council team grants, and then knowledge mobilization team grants, and then you keep going up and up to keep supporting whatever it is you enjoy doing. But start with small projects and small grants. But small project is key. Don't try to do a clinical trial on a $15,000 grant. Do chart reviews and qualitative studies and smaller science, basic science projects within that realm.
Awesome. So we have 1 minute. Oh, 1 minute. I was about to say 1 minute left, but it's just ending. Does anyone have a final really quick question?
Sure. Thank you, Michelle, and to everyone for your time, and Michelle for your kind comment, and of course to WICRI for this opportunity. And if anyone thinks of any questions afterwards, it's just sali@ualberta.ca. Feel free to reach out, or I am on Twitter at Dr. Samina Ali if you want to learn more about knowledge mobilization for children's pain.
And thank you so much, Dr. Ali, for spending your time with us today and giving that excellent presentation. We all really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Have a great day.